We're in England, in the village of Turville. It's 1871. Here, on one street, you can find a particular house. It's no different from the others, but many stay around it and wait for something. The house's doors open. Several adults come out of there. They look surprised and say that all the rumors turned out to be true. The woman goes out on the porch and asks a few more people to come in, and you're among them. You go inside, head into the room, and see an 11-year-old girl sleeping on the bed. She looks pale and thin. Despite loud people's conversations in the room, the girl doesn't wake up. Her mother says it's been 6 months since she fell asleep. You leave the room, and the next few people come in to see the sleeping girl with their own eyes. This is a story about the most prolonged sleep in history. The record belongs to a girl named Ellen Sadler, who slept for 9 years. She was born in the English village of Turville in the second half of the 19th century in a big family. Ellen was the 12th kid. Her parents weren't wealthy and worked hard to make ends meet. They taught their sons and daughters to help them from an early age, and Ellen was no exception. When she turned 11, she left home to work as a nanny in a nearby town. While away from her family and surrounded by strangers, Ellen began to feel bad. She had a headache, felt discomfort, and felt certain drowsiness. These symptoms became so severe that the girl couldn't work properly. She returned to the house in the village where her parents sent her to the hospital. The doctors didn't know how to help her because they couldn't diagnose her. They spent 18 weeks trying to cure the poor girl. As a result, still unwell, Ellen was discharged from the hospital. After returning home, she experienced severe headaches and drowsiness. Ellen Sadler felt worse and worse. And then, one day, she quietly lay down in her bed and fell asleep. Ellen woke up only after 9 years. All this time, the girl's mother took care of her. She fed her milk and tea. The sleeping girl was losing weight and strength. Soon, the whole village found out about Ellen. People started coming to her house to see an unusual phenomenon. They looked at her, tried to wake her up, and told their friends about her. The news about the sleeping girl spread throughout the country. Ellen had become a spectacle. People from all over England came to see a person who had been sleeping for several years. They called the house where Ellen's family lived Sleepy Cottage. Doctors and reporters came there. One journalist from the Daily Telegraph described that the girl's body was weak and too soft. Her feet were icy cold and her lips were blue. The child's breathing was barely discernible. It seemed that life was slowly leaving this body. The girl's family took donations for the care of their daughter. Therefore, many people thought it was all a performance. For some reason, the mother didn't allow the doctor to stay with Ellen for a long time. Some said that her mother gave her sleeping pills every day to not let her wake up. And someone claimed that they had seen a conscious girl sitting by the window. Also, the girl's mother rejected the doctor's offer to conduct a medical examination in a London hospital. We're unlikely to find out the whole truth about her since there was no official diagnosis from doctors. It's possible the girl fell into a coma or suffered from another disease that was unknown to science in the 19th century. It could be a chronic sleep disorder in which a person experiences uncontrollable bouts of drowsiness. You can walk down the street and want to sleep so much that you fall to the ground. Ellen grew up in a large family and got used to hard work early. Perhaps severe fatigue and lack of sleep provoked narcolepsy. In any case, this story had a good ending. One day, Ellen Sadler woke up. She didn't remember what had happened and was very surprised when her family told her about the 9-year-long dream. The girl's growth slowed down a little and her eyesight worsened, but her health wasn't bad. Ellen got married and had 6 children. In 1911, at the age of about 50, she passed away. Let's see a completely opposite story about a person who set a record for the longest time without sleep. In January 1964, 17-year-old Randy Gardner, a high school student, claimed he stayed awake for several weeks. The experiment started in December and ended in January. At the end of that time, he felt pretty normal. This event was in the Guinness Book of Records and allowed scientists to learn a lot about the structure of the human brain. Randy wanted to do a science school project related to sleep. He had to stay awake as long as possible, and his friend had to make sure that he was always awake. In the beginning, everything went well. Randy's friend kept a diary where he recorded the slightest changes in the subject's body. Randy held on easily for the first 2 days. He was constantly on his feet and didn't come to bed. After 3 days, his cognitive and sensory abilities began to decline. On the 4th day, Randy felt sick. He walked around the house and sniffed citrus fruits. The smell of lemons and oranges helped him get rid of this bad condition. During the day, Randy played basketball and went bowling with friends. The nights were boring because the guys didn't know what to do. But still, Randy didn't go to bed. A week passed and Randy showed excellent basketball results. His physical skills hadn't changed. His speech was clear and logical. By this moment, the news all over the country had been speaking about Randy and his experiment. He became a celebrity, and it also helped him stay awake. Scientists came to Randy. With the help of mathematical questions, they tested his intellectual abilities, and here he showed poor results. He was solving an example in mathematics, but then he forgot what was going on and what he was doing. Scientists scanned his brain and recorded its activity data. Then, on January 8, 1964 at 2 a.m., Randy broke the previous record time without sleep. He was awake for 264 hours. Scientists attached electrodes to his head when he fell asleep and observed brain activity. Randy woke up after a few hours of sleep to go to the toilet. Then, he lay in bed and got up only after 14 hours. He went to school in a great mood. Everyone was shocked. It seemed that his brain-heavy experiment had no negative consequences. Randy continued to study as before, play basketball, and spend time with friends. Scientists studied brain research results and found that Randy's brain was catching a light sleep all this time. These are called microsleeps, and the curious thing is that the person who's experiencing it may not even notice that they're technically sleeping. Several years passed. Everyone already forgot about this record. Randy grew up. One day, a reporter remembered Randy's experiment and interviewed him. He admitted that the experiment hadn't passed without a trace. For many years, Randy experienced severe insomnia. It was driving him crazy. He spent a lot of time and effort to overcome this disease. Fortunately, he managed to adjust his sleep regime. Randy slept 6 hours a day, which was quite enough. Repeating this experiment is a bad idea. Even 2 days without sleep are a great stress for the body. For thousands of years, people have survived hunger and complex work conditions. Our heart is trained to experience high loads, and our body can survive difficult situations. But our body has never encountered a lack of sleep in the entire history of humanity. Evolution has not taught us to endure sleepless nights without consequences, which is why it's bad for our health.
We've heard stories about people surviving in the desert, Amazon forest, and uninhabited islands for weeks. Such stories show how tough and resilient people can be. But among these many cases, there is one that can really amaze you. It's the story about a guy who spent 3 days inside a sunken ship at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. He didn't have oxygen tanks, electricity, communications, or food, but he survived. So, it all happened in 2013 on a tugboat that was moving through the Atlantic waters along the coast of Nigeria. That day, early in the morning, there was a small storm. The tug was pulling a vessel with oil tanks. Then, all of a sudden, a huge wave formed. It crashed into the ship and broke the cable. At 4:30 a.m., the tugboat turned upside down. Its entire deck was underwater, and the ship's hull stuck out from the surface. The boat began to sink slowly. The crew of 12 people were trapped, as they all were in their locked rooms. They had closed the doors in their cabins as a precaution, since there were many pirates in those waters. Because of the locked rooms, they couldn't get out. But one of them, cook Harrison Okina, was in the bathroom during this time. The bathroom turned over. Harrison fell on the ceiling. all the clothes and toilet shelves fell on his head. He was stunned and didn't understand what was happening. When he heard the screams of the other crew members, he realized that the ship was sinking. Harrison struggled to his feet. Holding on to the walls, he slowly went out of the cabin. The water level rose above his head. Harrison took a deep breath. He intuitively, driven by fear, reached the engineering room. There was a small pocket with air. This space wasn't wholly flooded, since the water didn't get there, and the air hadn't come out. Harrison realized that this was the safest place for him at that moment. He had no fresh water and no food. He was in a cold, damp room. The floor was flooded, and Harrison's feet began to freeze. There was almost no chance of survival. The man found a soda bottle inside the room and a life jacket with 2 flashlights attached to it. By this time, the ship had descended to the bottom of the ocean at a depth of 100 feet. This is about the height of a 10-story building. The ship's hull was squeezed and made a grinding noise due to the pressure of the water. Then, Harrison heard a strange movement outside the door. It was sharks and other fish that were investigating the deck. At this point, Harrison began to lose hope. Lack of food supplies and pressure weren't the main problems. The air pocket was small, which meant there was little oxygen. Every 24 hours, an average person consumes about 350 cubic feet of air, which means Harrison had less than 1 day left to breathe. But despite this, he lived in such conditions for about 60 hours. This happened thanks to the water. The pressure around the ship was so intense that it compressed the air by about 4 times. Another problem was the cook's breathing. When we inhale, we absorb oxygen. When we exhale, we release carbon dioxide. This substance is dangerous to your health if its concentration in the air is 5%. Harrison slowly filled the room with carbon dioxide, and he couldn't get out. With each hour, it became harder to breathe. But here again, he was lucky. Water absorbs carbon dioxide, and Harrison moved and splashed it in different directions. Thus, unknowingly, he increased the water area and kept the carbon dioxide level below critical. But even here, his dangers were not over. Hypothermia may occur in a dark, cold room. It's a condition when your body temperature drops below 95 degrees Fahrenheit. You get cold, and your perception of the world gets distorted. You don't understand where you are and what's going on. You may lose your memory and even experience terminal burrowing. This weird behavior occurs during hypothermia when a person tries to find a small shelter, even if they're in a closed room. They can even start digging the cold floor with their bare hands. At the same time, a person quickly freezes and loses consciousness within 2 hours. Harrison's room was filled from below with icy water. He wouldn't have survived in such conditions if he had stayed on the floor for several hours. But he managed to build a small platform with a mattress. This kept him slightly above the water level. With each passing hour, fear and despair more and more bound the survivor's mind. He couldn't get out for many reasons. One of them was that only a little sunlight passes to such a depth, and Harrison couldn't see it. The soda bottle was almost empty, and the flashlight stopped working. The man found himself in pitch darkness, but his salvation was close. While rescuers were searching for survivors nearby, he was thinking about his family and life. Harrison noticed rays of light through a hole in the wreckage. Divers were examining the seabed. It was the only chance to survive. Harrison came out of the air pocket and swam towards the rescuers. He was making his way through the darkness. The ray of light coming from the diver's flashlight disappeared. Harrison tried blindly to find the diver, but they were at the other end of the deck. His oxygen was running out, so Harrison decided to return. There was almost no air left in his lungs. He began to suffocate, but still got to the rescue room. The main thing was not to despair. It was his only chance for salvation. After catching his breath and replenishing the oxygen supply in his lungs, Harrison made a second attempt. He got out of the room and noticed the diver. He swam towards them with all of his might. The lifeguard didn't see Harrison, so the cook knocked on his neck from behind and grabbed his hand tightly. The diver was initially scared, But he realized a living person was in front of him. Harrison swam to his room and led the lifeguard as his oxygen ran out. You can easily find a recording from the diver's camera on the internet, where the frightened Harrison was in his rescue room during a meeting with the diver. The rescuers gave him an oxygen mask. They didn't believe there was a living person in front of them. Harrison couldn't immediately get to the surface because of the pressure. He spent about 60 hours on the seabed, so he needed to change the pressure levels slowly to prevent damage to his health. Therefore, the divers put him in a decompression chamber to gradually reduce the external pressure. Then, when Harrison got out, he saw the stars. The cook thought that he had been at the bottom of the ocean all day, so he was surprised when he found out that he had been underwater for 60 hours. Also, he thought that all the crew members had forgotten about him and left the ship at the beginning. Many years have passed since then, but Harrison still has nightmares about his air room. Sometimes he wakes up in the middle of the night and tells his wife that the bed is sinking and they're now at sea. A similar case occurred in 1991 with scuba diver Michael Proudfoot. He was studying a sunken submarine off the coast of Baja California. During this dive, he accidentally broke his breathing regulator and deprived himself of oxygen reserves. Michael couldn't get to the surface because he was too deep. He wouldn't have had enough air in his lungs. Fortunately, the diver found an air pocket inside the ship. He swam there and waited for rescuers. For 2 days, he was underwater in complete darkness. He ate raw sea urchins and drank a small amount of warm water from a found pot. Fortunately, rescuers found him. Michael Proudfoot got out of the trap and stayed alive. Just 1 day without sleep reduces your reaction speed, weakens your analytical skills, and causes stress. After 3 days without sleep, a person can feel irritable and their cognitive abilities decrease. A week without sleep can result in serious problems with your entire body. You no longer feel the difference between reality and imagination and have absolutely no idea what's happening around you. But in January of 1964, a young guy managed to stay awake for more than 11 days. And at the end of this period, he felt quite normal. This is the longest a person went without sleep. This event was even included in the Guinness Book of Records. It also allowed scientists to learn a lot about the structure of the human brain. It started at the end of December of 1963. 2 school students, 17-year-old Randy Gardner and his friend, started to think about an idea for a school science project. The friends quickly decided they would experiment with sleep. The goal was to stay awake for as long as possible and break the previous record. It was set by a DJ who managed to work for 260 hours straight. This is almost a full 11 days. Loud music and constant movement kept the DJ awake. But for Randy, it would be difficult to keep himself busy, especially at night. Initially, the topic of the project was the influence of insomnia on all kinds of people's abilities. But the guys quickly realized they didn't have the right equipment for a full-fledged study. That's why they decided to find out how sleep deprivation affects cognitive abilities, as well as basketball skills. Randy was supposed to stay active, and his friend tried to do everything to keep him awake. In the beginning, everything went well. Randy's friend kept a diary to record the smallest changes in Randy's body. The first 2 days were quite simple for Randy. He was constantly on his feet and didn't go to bed. He felt pleasant excitement, had fun, and did sports. Throughout all that time, his friend made notes in the diary. But on the 3rd day, the friend found himself sleeping against the wall. He had dozed off while writing notes. Luckily, Randy managed to stay awake. The guys quickly realized they couldn't cope with this without additional help. They called a 3rd friend and wrote an article for a San Diego newspaper. William Dement from Stanford University saw the article and got interested in this experiment. At that time, Dement was probably the only person in the world who studied the phenomenon of sleep. He immediately packed a suitcase and went to visit Randy. That's how 4 people got involved in the experiment. They tested Randy's sense of taste, hearing, and sense of smell. After 3 days, his cognitive and sensory abilities began to decline. The following morning, Randy felt nauseous. He walked around the house and found some citrus fruit. The smell of tangerines and oranges helped him get rid of the unpleasant sensations. The friends only slept one at a time. They never let Randy get bored. If he closed his eyes for even a second, sleep would instantly engulf him. One day, they played basketball for hours on end, and the next day, they went bowling. Once night fell, things got worse. At night, no one knew what to do. It was boring and difficult to keep Randy awake. Surprisingly, even after a week without sleep, Randy showed excellent results in basketball. He played even better than his friends. Also, his speech seemed clear and logical. By this time, most American newspapers had been writing about the experiment. Randy had become a celebrity, and it helped him stay awake. Other scientists came to observe the experiment. With the help of math exercises, they tested Randy's intellectual abilities, and that's where he showed poor results. He was solving a math problem when he forgot what was happening and what he was doing. The researchers also scanned the guy's brain and recorded its activity. Eventually, the experiment was nearing the end. In a few hours, Randy was going to break the previous record. He hadn't slept for almost 11 days. The scientists decided to take Randy to a special hospital to see how his brain would behave during sleep. On January 8, 1964, at 2 a.m., the new record was set. Randy hadn't slept for 264 hours. Finally, he could go to bed. The researchers attached electrodes to his head to observe his brain activity. Randy fell into a deep sleep. Several hours passed. He woke up, went to the bathroom, then went back to bed. It lasted 8 hours, 10 hours. Randy woke up only at the beginning of the 15th hour of sleep and just went to school. Everyone was shocked. It seemed this tricky experiment had no negative consequences. Randy continued to study as before, played basketball, and spent time with his friends. Meanwhile, scientists were studying the results of their research. It turned out that throughout all this time, Randy's brain kept napping. This meant that different parts of his brain slept one by one. When the guy played basketball, his analytical abilities were off. When he was solving math problems, the part of the brain responsible for reactions got turned off. In other words, one part of the brain had a little rest, and then it woke up, and another part of the brain had a nap. Randy wasn't the first person who didn't sleep for more than one night. Previously, the human brain had already experienced a lack of sleep and learned to rest in parts, distributing its resources evenly. But not all people are capable of this. Most likely, Randy was genetically predisposed to stay awake for so long. Several people tried to break the record, but no one managed to do it. During such experiments, lots of people got serious health problems. They brought themselves to the state where they saw hallucinations, forgot what had happened to them just a couple minutes before, couldn't think, and even behaved extremely unfriendly. And no wonder. Lack of sleep causes anxiety and bad stress. Without sleep, your body just can't function properly. This can lead to problems if you go outside. But even at home, you can forget about the stove or an iron you haven't turned off. You risk falling asleep at the most inopportune moment. You might see a unicorn and run after it without thinking about the consequences. You may lose your feeling of hunger, or, on the contrary, start eating a lot. And all of this could lead to stomach problems. No one should conduct such experiments. That's why the Guinness Book of Records stopped registering attempts to break Randy's record, so that people could no longer harm themselves. But let's return to our story. A long time passed. Everyone forgot about the record. And then, one day, Randy gave an interview. In it, he admitted he had experienced insomnia for a long time after the experiment. For years, he'd been struggling with this problem. Then he managed to set up a normal sleep schedule. Randy could fall asleep, but he rested for no more than 6 hours a day. Nature gave the human body the ability to survive in extreme situations. For example, if you don't eat for a long time, your body activates its survival mode. It takes food from your fat cells or muscle tissues. This way, it launches the process of using all currently available resources. A person can live without food for several weeks and without water for several days. As soon as a person gets food and water, their body recovers. The same goes for endurance. For thousands of years, people ran to survive. Our heart has learned to withstand enormous loads. But people have never had to face a lack of sleep in the entire history of evolution. This is why your brain is not adapted to long periods of wakefulness. Afterward, it may not recover because it doesn't know how to do it. But the brain's evolution may begin right now. People have never experienced such a lack of sleep as they do today. Social networks, parties, TV shows, exhausting office work, frequent flights, all this puts more pressure on the brain than ever before. In the past, a person could hunt a mammoth, return to the cave, and immediately go to bed. Now, after a tough working day, many people surf the internet and tire themselves even more. That's why it's so important to set up a good sleep schedule.
There are very snowy winters in Sweden, you know. Snow covers all roads and slows down the traffic. Some cars may pull over to the side of the road and get out only with the help of a tractor. This is a common thing. But one day, during a snowfall, something astonishing happened. On December 19, 2011, a man named Peter Skylberg found himself in a snow trap after he drove off the main road in the north of Sweden. Then snowmobilers accidentally found him, pulled him out of there, and took him to the hospital. It may seem like something common, but here's the kicker. It took 2 months to find him, and outside of that time, the temperature dropped to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. That man survived after spending 60 days without water, food, and heat sources among icy winds and endless snow. The people who found him said the car was buried deep in snow at 3 feet. And Peter Skylberg was sitting shaking inside a sleeping bag in the front seat. He couldn't speak. When they brought him to the hospital, the doctors were amazed. They knew cases when people survived in cold temperatures for a long time, but not for 2 months. A person can live without water for several days, but Peter had no problems with this since he extracted water from the snow. Without food, a person can survive for several weeks to 3 months. But what about the cold? How did Peter solve this problem? At such low temperatures, people can freeze within several hours. The doctors treating Peter claimed that his body seemed to activate survival mode and fell into a deep sleep. It's like bears that hibernate during winter. But the human body can only lower the temperature by a few degrees. This is not enough to survive in minus 22-degree frost. Maybe the man somehow managed to lower the temperature even more. The case of Peter Skylberg became famous. Doctors and scientists from all over the world put forward their hypotheses about how this man managed to survive. No one could give the exact reason. Many people claimed it was just a real miracle. Others believed it was the result of several factors combined together. One of these factors is the sleeping bag. It helps keep your body heat better so your temperature may not drop for a long time inside the bag. Another factor that probably played the key role was the igloo effect. Indigenous peoples living at the North Pole make their homes out of ice and snow. You've probably seen these round houses on the internet or in the movies. It's not warm inside them, but it doesn't let the cold in. The particular design of these houses helps keep the accumulated heat inside. Igloos can protect from strong winds, but it's possible to survive inside them only if you're wearing warm clothes. Perhaps Peter's car turned into such a house. Snow clung to it from all sides and blocked the heat inside. Many people wondered why he hadn't tried to get out and find help. But seems like Peter did the right thing. It's pretty dangerous to go out in such conditions. You don't know where you are, it's freezing cold, and there's a blizzard. Let's say you get out of the car and try to get to the nearest road. You fail and come back. But you can't find your car because the snow has covered it. Now your situation is even worse. The only option is to start digging snow and make an igloo. If you have warm clothes, an igloo will help you to keep warm and gain some time. But the right solution is to stay inside the car and wait for the rescuers, especially if you don't know where you are. If you don't have communication or signal lights, then try to make a fire. Smoke can attract the attention of people passing on the nearest road. Peter Skylberg spent some time in the hospital, regained strength, and was cured. Now, it's much safer to be in a closed cold room or an igloo during the cold. However, if you're stuck in a severe frost without warm clothes, You have about 30 minutes to 2 hours, maybe even less if you don't move. But in 1980, a miracle happened that shocked people and doctors all over the U.S. 19-year-old Jean Hilliard was driving home at night to the small town of Lengby. She lost control and ended up in a ditch. The girl decided to walk to her friend. She then saw her friend's house, but she didn't get there. She got too weak and fainted. Suddenly, Jean fell and lost consciousness near her friend's house. Jean Hilliard was wearing a light winter coat, cowboy boots, and pants, so she wasn't quite prepared for harsh winter conditions. There was a strong blizzard and snowfall outside, so no one noticed her. The friend Jean wanted to visit only saw the frozen girl near his porch in the morning. Jean Hilliard had been lying there for 6 hours. Her body was hard and cold, as if it were made of rubber. Her eyes looked as if they were made of glass. The man who noticed the girl was sure she wasn't alive. But then, he saw bubbles of moisture from her nose. The girl was breathing. He got the girl to the hospital. Her body wouldn't bend, so putting the girl in the car was problematic. The doctors immediately rushed to help Jean, but that wasn't easy. They couldn't even make any injections, as the needles would constantly break. The muscles were too stiff and frozen. Her body activated emergency mode and stopped supplying muscles and soft tissues with blood. All the red liquid was directed at the vital organs. Also, in emergency mode, our organism can slow down all internal processes of the body. The heart starts pounding slower, the lungs consume less oxygen, and the metabolism nearly stops. Such energy savings helped the girl to survive. But the doctors were more surprised that Jean didn't get any serious troubles. She got frostbite, but the ice crystals didn't destroy her skin and soft tissues. Doctors decided to warm the girl with a bunch of heating pads. Then they finally managed to inject medications. A few hours later, she regained consciousness. The test showed that Jean was in perfect health. Meanwhile, you can get into a severe trap not only in nature and bad weather. You can get stuck in an elevator in a building full of people in Manhattan, and no one will know about it. This happened in 1999 with Nicholas White. The 34-year-old manager was working late in the office and decided to take a break. After getting some fresh air outside, Nicholas called the elevator to go back to the 43rd floor. But he got trapped in the elevator. It was already quite late, and almost all the workers had left the building. But the worst thing was that it was Friday night. Nicholas had no phone, no food, and no water. He pressed the emergency call button, but no one answered him. The cameras worked perfectly, but the guards didn't see him. The building was basically empty. Nicholas struggled with claustrophobia, walked from side to side, jumped, laid down, tried to open the doors, and waited for someone to rescue him. There were repair workers on the other floors, but they didn't hear Nicholas. Also, his colleagues stayed in the office where he worked. They were sure that Nicholas had just gone home. They left the office using other elevators and didn't notice that Nicholas had left his things on his desk. Well, Nicholas was in despair. He was rescued 41 hours later. He was lying on the elevator floor, tormented by thirst, when he suddenly heard a voice from the elevator speaker. "Hey, is anyone there?" Rescuers got the man out of the metal box, and the building owners paid him compensation for the inconvenience. Despite this nightmare, Nicholas continued to use the elevators. Yeah, living in Manhattan, it would be problematic to avoid them. Certainly for Nicholas, life has its ups and downs. Hey, want to hear something shocking? In an ordinary house outlet that we use to charge the phone, the voltage is 110 volts. A high-voltage power line that provides electricity to dozens of buildings has a voltage of 100,000 volts. The energy of one lightning strike is more than 10 million volts. Woo! And the temperature of lightning is almost twice the temperature on the sun's surface. And this incredible charge is flying at a speed of just 2.5 times slower than the speed of light. Now imagine what happens to a person when lightning strikes them. Well, let me tell you, the discharge passes through the body in 1/100th of a second. Lightning can stop our hearts and disrupt the work of our entire nervous system. You may not even realize what has happened at first. Perhaps you will lose consciousness and your body will be in a state of shock. Every day, there are several million lightning strikes in the world. Fortunately, you have little chance of getting hit by one. The odds that lightning will strike you is about 15,300 to 1. About 20,000 people are struck by lightning every year. The chances that lightning will strike you twice are even smaller. And what are the odds that you'll be struck by lightning 7 times throughout your life? It seems impossible, but one person experienced it for himself. His name was Roy Sullivan. He was born in 1912 in Greene County, Virginia, in a big family with 7 children. Roy was an ordinary guy and was no different from his brothers and sisters. But for some reason, the natural element chose him. In 1936, he began working as a ranger at Shenandoah National Park. There, lightning struck him 7 times over 35 years. So, the first accident happened in April 1942. On that day, a strong thunderstorm began. Roy took refuge in a new fire tower where builders hadn't installed a lightning rod. Lightning struck the building several times. A massive fire started inside and Roy ran out. As soon as he was a few feet away from the shelter, lightning hit his toe and burned a hole in his shoe. The next time occurred 27 years later, in July 1969. Roy was working in the national park. He was driving a truck through hilly terrain when a storm started. Lightning struck him through the open car window. The charge burned his eyebrows and eyelashes and slightly touched his hair. Roy lost consciousness and the car continued to move. It stopped at the very edge of a cliff. 15 minutes later, Roy came to his senses. A year later, in July 1970, the third time occurred. The weather was fine, but in a matter of minutes, clouds became thicker and a thunderstorm began. Lightning struck a transformer near Roy. The man ran away as fast as possible, but nature got him again. Lightning hit his shoulder. 2 years later, in 1972, lightning struck Roy for the 4th time while he was working at the National Park Station. The charge set his hair on fire, and the man ran to the bathroom and used a wet towel to put out the flames on his burning head. From that moment, Roy began to suspect that some invisible evil force had been pursuing him. He started to carry a bottle of water with him to put out the fire in case of another hit. The 5th strike happened in the national park again. It occurred in 1973. Roy tripped over a rock and fell. At that moment, he noticed thunderclouds in the sky. Frightened, he ran to his truck, got inside, and stepped on the gas. Roy drove as far from that spot as possible. Then he stopped and got out of the car to see where the storm was. And at that moment, lightning struck again. It went through his left arm and left leg and set his shoe on fire. Roy quickly climbed back into the truck and extinguished the fire using his water bottle. In 1976, the 6th case occurred. Roy was walking along a trail in the park, just 1 mile away from the place where lightning struck him the last time. And then storm clouds appeared again. Lightning flashed and stung Roy in the palm. After the 6th strike, he began to suspect something was wrong with the park. After 40 years of working, Roy finally decided to quit. Finally. He hoped the lightning would stop chasing him, but he was wrong. By that time, the man had already become a celebrity. But such fame didn't let him enjoy life. People were afraid to be near him because they believed the lightning could hit them at any moment. Journalists gave Roy Sullivan the nicknames Spark Ranger and Human Lightning Conductor. Of course, the man disliked all of this and felt very lonely. But besides this problem, he also suffered from constant fears and the feeling of persecution. All the time, he was waiting for the lightning to strike again at any moment. Fortunately, he was married. His wife supported him and helped him in everything. After quitting his job, Roy decided to move with his wife to the small town of Dooms, Virginia. Wow, Dooms. Talk about foreshadowing. It was only a year without accidents. Then, on June 25, 1977, lightning struck Roy again. He went fishing at the local pond early in the morning. The catch was good, but the sky was overcast. Roy immediately felt there would be a strike. There was a smell of sulfur in the air, and the hairs on his arms stood on end. His whole body tensed. Lightning struck Roy in the head, passing through his chest and stomach. The man ran to his car to take cover. At that moment, a hungry bear came out of the forest. He approached Roy's bucket of fish to pick up all the trout the man had caught. Roy ran out of the vehicle with his hair on his head smoldering to chase the animal away. After the seventh lightning strike, he lost hearing in his left ear and realized he couldn't hide from the lightning anywhere. His wife was afraid to be with him outside during a thunderstorm. One day, she was hanging laundry in the backyard. Roy came out of the house to help her. A few minutes later, lightning struck his wife. Fortunately, she wasn't badly injured. After that, besides fear and social loneliness, he felt guilt. Of course, many doctors and scientists tried to help Roy, but no one managed to find the reason for this strange phenomenon. According to science, each time it was just a coincidence. Mathematics and physics were powerless here. With such answers from scientists, Roy believed that invisible forces were pursuing him or that fate was punishing him for something. Perhaps the answer lies in the man's past. The National Park Service and doctors documented all 7 times when he was struck by lightning. But there was another 8th time, which couldn't be confirmed. According to Roy, lightning struck him in his youth when he was helping his father mow wheat. The discharge hit the scythe blade. No one but the boy saw it. Perhaps at that moment, the lightning changed something in his body and made him more attractive for the next hits. Lightning always chooses the path of least resistance. And this is how lightning occurs. Rain, ice, and snow particles collide with one another inside a storm. This process increases the imbalance between clouds and the ground, negatively charging the lower layers of clouds. Things down there, like trees and the earth, get positively charged and create another imbalance. Nature tries to remedy this imbalance between the two opposite charges by passing an electric current through them. Perhaps nature felt some charge imbalance in Roy's body and tried to remedy it. But why did he get struck at an interval of 1 to 2 years? Besides, more than 20 years passed between the first and second hit. Scientists still can't explain what happened to him. Maybe Roy was just an attractive guy. As you can probably predict, Roy Sullivan was listed in the Guinness Book of Records as the person struck by lightning most often in the world.
Aomori Prison, Japan, 1936. Yoshi Shiratori was walking back and forth inside his prison cell, contemplating how he was wrongly accused of a crime he didn't commit. He didn't deserve to live the rest of his days as a prisoner. He needed to escape this filthy, cruel, and cold place where he was being mistreated every single day. But how? Aomori Prison was not the easiest one to escape, so he needed to be clever and patient to be able to come up with a solid plan. Shiratori started by observing the guards' routines. He was aware that even one tiny mistake could bring an end to him, so he had to memorize their every move with great precision. After studying their schedules for months, he realized that there was a 15-minute gap in their patrol time from 5:30 a.m. to 5:45 a.m. This was it. He had found his escape window. But then there was the problem of how he was going to pick his cell's lock. Shiratori was not the one to give up in the face of one minor inconvenience. Prisoners were provided with bathing buckets when they were inside the bathhouse. To his surprise, Shiratori realized that these were wrapped with a metal support ring which he could use as a wire. So, one day, he smuggled one back into his cell and waited for his moment to freedom. When the clock struck 5:30 a.m. and the coast was finally clear, Shiratori made his move. His hands were shaking due to the cold as he tried to pick the lock, and the fear of getting caught did not help either. It took him a few minutes, but he was finally able to kick his cell door open and run to his freedom. At 5:45 a.m., guards returned and checked his cell. To them, everything looked normal. Shiratori was sound asleep in his bed. But of course, what they didn't realize was the fact that it was not actually him who was under the blanket. Before he left, Shiratori had placed pieces of floorboard onto his futon to trick the guards to buy himself more time. So, nobody suspected anything until the next morning. But by then, Shiratori was long gone. However, this was only the beginning of Shiratori's story, who would later be known as the legendary prison break magician. 3 days after his first escape, Shiratori got caught again while trying to steal supplies from a hospital. And just like that, he was back in prison. This time, he was sentenced to life for his escape attempt. He had no hopes to see his wife and daughter ever again. All those months of planning were for nothing. And on top of everything, in 1942, he got transferred to Akita prison, where the conditions were even harsher than before. The guards who had heard about his escape attempt were determined to make an example out of him. In addition to all the extreme manual labor he had to do, he was forced to sleep on the hard concrete floor during the severe winter cold. And when he wasn't working, he was placed into solitary confinement for extended periods of time to make sure he could never attempt anything funny. You see, this isolation cell was specially designed to keep escape artists from escaping. It was very small, had a very high ceiling, and smooth copper walls that would make it impossible to climb. In addition, there was no sunlight whatsoever. The only window in the cell was the small one located in the ceiling. And on top of everything, Shiratori was handcuffed and mistreated by the guards at all times. However, one of them, Kobayashi, took pity on him and was concerned for his well-being. That's why he checked up on him from time to time, which made his miserable life a bit more bearable inside this awful place. On the stormy night of June 15th, at around midnight, the guards peered into the solitary cell and couldn't believe their eyes. Shiratori was nowhere to be found, and all that was left were his handcuffs. But how did he do it? First of all, Shiratori knew all the tricks to get out of cuffs, so they simply didn't work on him. Once his hands were free, by pressing his palms and soles of his feet on the smooth copper walls, he climbed the unclimbable wall with ease. The ceiling window was sealed, but Shiratori noticed that the wooden framing around it started to rot. So, night after night, he climbed there when the guards weren't looking and loosened the framing bit by bit. He finally succeeded in breaking the rusted fittings. However, he waited until one stormy night so that when he was out, no one would be able to hear his footsteps on the roof. 3 months later, Shiratori knocked on the door of the person whom he thought to be his friend, Kobayashi. He wanted him to stand by his side as he fought against the corrupt prison system. Since he was the only guard who respected him, Shiratori felt like he could trust him to do the right thing. But this was a big mistake. When Shiratori went to the bathroom, Kobayashi wasted no time informing the authorities that he was there. So, Shiratori was arrested and sent back to prison for a third time. Since he became something of a legend at this point, the authorities wanted to make sure he could not escape for a third time. So, they sent him to the most notorious and high-security Abashiri prison. It was in the northern part of the country and got plenty of snow, so no prisoner dared escape it with their thin uniforms. At first, he was thrown into an open cell exposed to the extreme cold while still wearing his summer prison uniform, and the guards were awful to him. One time, he got so angry that he broke his handcuffs in front of them, but that just made things even worse. He got locked in a cell wearing heavy iron restraints fitted around his ankles and wrists, which required 2 hours to unlock by a blacksmith. Shiratori vowed to escape, but this time, it all seemed impossible. Yet again, he found a way. Every day when the guards delivered prisoners their meals, Shiratori would drip his miso soup on his iron shackles as well as the food slot on his cell door. This ever so slowly wore down the metal, and finally, he was able to slip out of the chains. The hole, however, was still too small to fit a person, so Shiratori dislocated his own shoulder to slip through the hatch. He was a free man once more, as well as the first man to ever escape Abashiri prison. He went into hiding for over a year, but was caught again after he had a fight with a farmer for stealing a tomato from his farm. Authorities were not going to leave anything to chance now, and they locked him up at the Sapporo prison. The only opening in his cell was smaller than his head, and there were guards standing in front of it 24 hours a day. So you can imagine the shock they felt when they couldn't find Shiratori there one day. This time, Shiratori managed to escape by digging a tunnel right under his bed using a miso soup bowl. He was a free man for a year until one day an officer sat next to him on a park bench. He didn't realize his true identity, but Shiratori was so moved by his kind attitude that he decided to reveal himself. He was arrested once again, but this time, having reviewed his case, the court revoked the harsh conditions of his sentence and sent him to the more comfortable Fuchu prison in Tokyo, where he was released even earlier for good behavior. He was finally able to reunite with his daughter as a truly free man.
The night was dark and scary. A few hundred people were sitting in lifeboats, not knowing what would happen next or what their lives would look like from that moment on. All they knew was the giant ship they had been sailing on just a couple of hours earlier disappeared in front of their eyes. They were alone, waiting for help. Is anyone even coming? They had no idea if the rest of the ships that were traveling relatively close to them had heard their call for help. There was nothing else to do but wait. The Titanic, an iceberg, and one night, April 14th, 1912. It's one of the most famous stories from modern history that everyone talks about, even now, more than 100 years later. The 16 lifeboats on board could only accommodate a little more than 50%, 1,178 people, of the total number of passengers that were on board. And many of them were still half empty. In one of them, there was a little 2-month-old girl, Milvina Dean, the youngest passenger on board the giant ship. Her parents had decided to leave England because they wanted to build a better life in the United States. Her father had some family in Kansas, and he hoped they could start their own business there. The Dean family didn't actually choose to be on board this giant legendary liner, but because of a coal strike, they got transferred there, so they boarded it at Southampton as third-class passengers. Milvina's father felt when their ship hit the iceberg on that cold and seemingly peaceful night. He immediately went up to investigate. When he saw that people were panicking and that the crew members were giving warnings on the actual danger of the situation, he rushed to their cabin to find his wife. He told her to dress the children and quickly go up on deck. The crew members gave the order to get the lifeboats ready and start transferring women and children there first. It was a chance for at least some family members to get to safety. Milvina, her mother, and her brother got in Lifeboat 10. They were among the first off the liner out of the 706 crew members and passengers who managed to escape the sinking ship. Later, the liner called Carpathia heard their call for help, came for the passengers, and took them to New York. Her father, unfortunately, stayed behind them and didn't manage to save himself. Milvina grew up in Ashurst, England, which wasn't far from where she set sail on the ship. She spent her life working as a secretary and an assistant in small businesses in Southampton. She never married. Milvina always used to say she never spoke about the whole Titanic thing because she remembered nothing about it, so she didn't want people to think she was just drawing attention to herself. But in 1985, a French-American team got together and located the wreck of the Titanic. It was around 370 miles east of Mistaken Point, Newfoundland, in water that was more than 2 miles deep. That's when they confirmed the ship split in two. For decades, people believed the ship sank in one piece. They thought the only significant damage was the damage the hull got from its contact with the iceberg. In reality, it broke in half, right between its third and fourth funnels. It happened shortly before the ship disappeared under the surface of the water, and the whole thing, starting from the moment when they hit the iceberg, lasted around 2 hours and 40 minutes. People didn't pay that much attention to the Titanic until this team of researchers found the wreck. In the last year of her life, she sold some of her family's possessions at auction to pay for her stay in a nursing home. The items she sold also included a suitcase filled with clothes that her family got when they arrived in the US, and compensation letters her mom got from the Titanic Relief Fund. The compensation letters outlined the financial aid that certain passengers received who had survived the loss of their loved ones. She lived until the age of 97 when she caught pneumonia. She was the youngest of the 705 people that survived the whole event. The Titanic was the world's largest ship. Since it was so big, some thought the vessel should have had 4 exhaust stacks. But Thomas Andrews, the man who designed the ship, believed that only 3 were necessary. So, the Titanic basically had one purely decorative stack. 2,200 people were on board when the ship sank. There were 908 crew members, and the maximum number of passengers on board, which was 3,500. As you probably saw in the movie, there were different classes of passengers. The estimated overall wealth of those in first class was about $500 million, and researchers estimated $6 million worth of things went down to the ocean bottom, together with the ship. In first class, this liner was a place of luxury. It had 4 restaurants, 2 libraries, 2 barber shops, reading rooms, and a photographic darkroom on board. There was also a heated swimming pool, but only first-class passengers could use it, at a price of 1 shilling a time. The ship also had Turkish baths and electric baths, and passengers could use each for 4 shillings at a time. The cost to build this massive giant was $7.5 million, but that was back in 1912. Today, it would be about $200 million. First-class tickets cost $2,560 at the time, which is today's equivalent of $61,000. What would you get in these expensive cabins? A sitting room, 2 bedrooms, 2 wardrobe rooms, and a bathroom. Would you pay that much for those luxuries? Teams of researchers still haven't explored many areas on the Titanic. It's still very, very hard to access them with underwater vehicles. There was a lifeboat drill scheduled for the same day the Titanic sank, but it was called off for some reason. The crew had done just 1 lifeboat drill, and that was when the ship was still docked. But even if the crew members had been properly trained and each lifeboat had been filled, the capacity was still not enough to save each and every passenger. The Titanic was the biggest movable object in the world at that time. On May 31st, 1911, its immense hull made its way down the slipways and ended up in the River Lagan in Belfast. Over 100,000 people were there to see the launch, which took just a little more than a minute and went off without a hitch. The people who were in charge of the ship immediately towed the hull to a mammoth fitting-out dock. Thousands of workers spent most of the next year there working hard, building the decks and constructing all those luxury interiors that gave the Titanic its specific look. They were also installing the 29 giant boilers that would power the ship's 2 main steam engines. All that to get the title Unsinkable. The ship had more than just one fatal flaw. You may have heard of one of its design flaws. The airtight bulkheads weren't completely sealed on top. This allowed water to flow from one compartment to another, which eventually sank the liner. And Titanic had more flaws. High sulfur content, cold temperatures, and high speeds largely affected the steel of the vessel's hull and the iron of its rivets. The steel here shattered, while the rivets popped out relatively easily. This was the reason the Titanic sunk 24 times faster than we'd expect. There are many theories about what really led to the sinking of such a giant. And one says a full moon from a couple of months before could be one of the reasons. It may have created very strong tides that sent a flotilla of icebergs southward. This was right in time for the Titanic's maiden voyage. Research says an optical illusion prevented the ship from getting help. One famous British historian, Tim Moulton, thought the atmosphere on the night of the sinking created specific conditions that made it very hard for the crew members to spot icebergs. They partially caused something called superrefraction. The extraordinary bending of light causes miraging, and several ships in the area recorded it. Not only did this prevent the crew from seeing the troublesome iceberg in time, but it also stopped one of the ships that could have offered help from identifying the call for help and communicating with the Titanic crew. Also, some say the ship was traveling too fast. From the start, they blamed the skipper for sailing such a big liner at such a high speed, 22 knots, through the cold and unpredictable waters of the North Atlantic, which was full of hidden icebergs.
Not many survival stories can rival the miracle that happened to Marine Lieutenant Colonel William Henry Rankin in 1959. See for yourself. One bad day, this man nearly drowned, falling from the sky. Are you saying that it sounds too paradoxical to be true? Then take a seat. I'll tell you a story. It was July 26, 1959, when Rankin was piloting his F-8 Crusader, a single-engine supersonic aircraft, along the North Carolina coast. It was a high-altitude flight, and Rankin, together with his wingman, Navy Lieutenant Herbert Nolan, were flying at the height of more than 47,000 feet. Their jets, nicknamed Candy Stripers because of their unusual orange and silver-gray coloring, were moving through the air smoothly and lightning fast. The only thing that could cause some trouble was a storm that was raging far beneath the plains. But now, it didn't present any threat. However, the pilots were supposed to pass through this storm on their way to the Marine Air Base in Beaufort, South Carolina. Things took a turn for the worse when the aircraft was approximately 9 miles and mere minutes away from the military base. Suddenly, Rankin's engine quit, and the fire warning light switched on. Unable to restart the engine that had lost all power, the man knew he didn't have many options. That's why, desperately trying to keep his plane from gaining speed and going into a complete nosedive, Rankin radioed his partner.
Engine failure? I have to eject.
It was a terrifying decision since the altitude was too extreme and the Marine didn't have a pressure suit. The only thing that could help him survive was an oxygen mask with a limited oxygen supply. In any case, the pilot didn't have a choice. Without hesitation, he pulled the overhead handle that triggered the ejection, and in no time, he was in the air, and his plane disappeared in the clouds below. Now Rankin was in a free fall at a height of 40,000 feet, with a temperature of minus 65 degrees F. Usually, sport skydivers make their jumps from a height of 3,500 to 10,000 feet. Only highly experienced experts jump from altitudes higher than 15,000 feet. Even then, it can lead to serious complications if they don't have all the necessary equipment, including a pressure suit, which, as you remember, Rankin didn't have. That means that when the man found himself in the air at such an unprecedented height, he experienced severe decompression. It felt as if his stomach had increased to twice its size, and his nose seemed like it was about to explode. His eyes, ears, and mouth started to bleed. For several blood-curdling moments, the Marine was sure that the decompression would finish him right away. Little did he know, he had a much more severe trial ahead. Rankin continued falling, and all he could feel besides all-encompassing fear was the shocking cold. His wrists and ankles were burning as if someone had put ice directly on his skin. He'd lost one of his gloves while leaving the plane, and his left hand felt completely numb, and to make matters even worse, he was still in free fall. Of course, the pilot had a parachute, but it was supposed to deploy automatically at an altitude of 10,000 feet, and even if Rankin had decided to open it, he simply wouldn't have been able to do this. That's why, in a matter of seconds and at a dizzying speed, the man hit the very storm he'd been piloting his plane over just minutes before. And that's when another calamity happened. Rankin had been falling through the black clouds with almost no visibility for about 5 minutes, surrounded by lightning, rain, hail, and violent winds, when something went wrong with the barometer that was supposed to deploy his parachute automatically. Fooled by the violent weather raging around the marine, it triggered prematurely, and the man got stuck in the very middle of a thunderstorm. But it wasn't just any old thunderstorm. Nope. The unlucky 39-year-old fighter pilot plunged straight into a cumulonimbus cloud. These clouds, which often look like huge puffy mushrooms, are incredibly dense and tend to appear in areas where the atmosphere is extremely unstable. Also, such clouds are vertical, and the peaks of the most monstrous ones can reach the height of 70,000 feet. The taller the cumulonimbus cloud is, the more unstable and violent it is inside. That was the circumstance Rankin ended up in after his parachute opened too early. Conversely, even if his parachute had deployed at the supposed altitude of 10,000 feet, the man would still have been sucked back up into the cloud with the updraft. In any case, the pilot didn't have time to dwell on this. His body was tossed about as if he was nothing more than a rag doll. He would hit the fabric of his parachute, fall back down, and repeat this cycle again. The tossing was so bad that even the experienced fighter pilot felt seasick. Lightning snapped and crackled around Rankin, and even though he didn't hear the thunder per se, he could feel it vibrating through his body. The hailstones were so big that at some moments Rankin worried they would tear his parachute. The worst happened when the pilot was falling through the rain. For several terrifying moments, the man was sure that he would drown. He was trying to take a breath, but only breathed in mouthfuls of water. If he'd stayed in that region of the storm for any longer, drowning while falling through the air would have become a frighteningly real outcome. He tried to hold his breath, but it was a very dangerous thing to do while falling at breakneck speed. Meanwhile, Rankin was also blown up and down, sometimes as much as 5,000 feet at a time. It seemed to him like he'd been falling for ages, with blasts of compressed air hitting him the whole time. Fortunately, not only good things, but bad ones too, tend to come to an end. When Rankin finally reached the bottom of the cumulonimbus tower, he'd been inside for more than 40 agonizing minutes. The pilot was shocked to discover that he was relatively unscathed. The lightning hadn't grazed him, his parachute was in one piece, and he hadn't drowned in the rainwater. The only thing he had to worry about now was a safe landing. At first, Rankin was going down toward a clearing, but his bad luck continued, because at the last moment, a powerful gust of wind threw him into a tree. The parachute got tangled in the branches, and the pilot hit his head on the trunk. Luckily, he was still wearing his helmet and didn't lose consciousness. After freeing himself and staggering to his feet, the pilot limped through the forest until he found a country road. But hitching a ride turned out to be a tough task. Imagine a man standing on the side of the road, covered in blood and dressed in a soaked, ripped-up flight suit. No wonder there weren't many volunteers to give him a lift. But eventually, someone picked him up and drove to a payphone where Rankin managed to call for an ambulance. There, he found out what a lucky man he really was. He had countless bruises and welts scattered all over his body. He suffered from bad decompression effects, and he had frostbite. But other than that, the ordeal didn't leave any long-term damage. Rankin spent several weeks in the hospital and made a complete recovery. Later, he wrote the book, The Man Who Rode the Thunder, where he described his experience. If you know other incredible survival stories, let me know down in the comments. If you learned something new today, then give this video a like and share it with a friend. But hey, don't go bail out on me just yet. We have over 2,000 cool videos for you to check out. All you have to do is pick the left or right video, click on it, and enjoy. Stay on the bright side of life.
You wake up in your house and take out an umbrella. It's Saturday, and it's cleaning time. You reach for the magical button, and the dishes, furniture, walls, floors, and even your clothes in the closet get sparkling clean. You have the rest of the day to yourself, and so you lie on the dust-free couch with your favorite book. This sci-fi setting was everyday reality for Frances Gabe for decades. She didn't clean her house at all. She didn't hire anyone to do it, yet it remained perfectly clean. Frances was born in 1915 in Idaho. Her father, Frederick, was an architect and building contractor. The family had to move a lot for his job, and Frances attended 18 elementary schools. She said she was born a most unusual person, and Everything moved much too slowly for her at school. The girl preferred the company of her dad and his coworkers. She watched them and learned their craft. Frances graduated from Girls Polytechnic High School in Portland at 16. Next year, she got married. By the late 1970s, she was divorced and a single mother of 2 kids. She always thought of housework as a thankless, unending job. One day, she noticed fig jam slithering down her wall. Frances got so mad, she decided to put an end to all of this for good. She brought out the garden hose, got rid of the jam, and started designing her own self-cleaning house. She spent more than a decade and thousands of dollars of her own savings transitioning her Oregon home into a giant floor-to-ceiling dishwasher. By 1984, it was all finished. Frances received an official U.S. patent for her self-cleaning building construction. It consisted of 68 separate devices that made all the cleaning fully automated. Every room had sprinklers in the ceiling. Frances would put on her raincoat, take out an umbrella, and press a button to activate the sprinklers. They'd spray soap and water in a circular motion. Then it was all rinsed. Warm air then went through the vents to dry it all. In less than an hour, the walls, floors, bathrooms, toilet, and bath were all crisp, clean, and dry. The floors were coated with many layers of marine varnish and ever so slightly tilted toward the walls. There were gutters at the edge of every room. Water from the sprinklers didn't go to waste. It drained out of the house into the doghouse to wash the dog along the way. Furniture that wasn't supposed to get rinsed was covered in clear acrylic cases made of resin. Books had waterproof jackets. Papers were sealed in a plastic box, and pictures on the walls, including the patent, had glass cases to keep them safe. Awnings covered the beds to keep linen dry. Frances also invented her own waterproof fabric for the upholstery. The cupboard would make dishes clean without any assistance needed. Clothes would be placed inside a cabinet on hangers, washed and dried, and then, still on hangers, pulled into the closet with chains. The electrical outlets were all safely covered, of course. There were no carpets or curtains, no dust collectors allowed. Sometimes, the pipes would burst and water would spray in all unwanted directions. But all in all, it was running smoothly for about 20 years. Frances was dreaming about more self-cleaning homes and even self-cleaning office buildings, hospitals, and villages around the world. Her idea was to help single moms and women fed up with cleaning, and also people who can't clean due to health issues. She was traveling the U.S. giving lectures on her invention and showing a model of her design. She was featured in newspapers and on TV, but the idea never took off. By 2002, she couldn't afford to run the house and renew her patents, so they expired. Frances gave tours of the house, so she had some money, but that wasn't enough. This and natural disasters like floods and earthquakes turned the once cleanest house into a cluttered construction. In 2009, the lady moved into a retirement home. The house was sold some years later to a new owner who now has to clean it himself. Many people mocked the idea, and the self-cleaning home revolution never happened. Still, architects and builders these days admit her idea was functional and worth bringing to life. In 1998, when computers were taking off and taking up all of your attention, someone came up with and patented a brilliant idea of a motivational candy dispenser. It would be equipped with an optical sensor attached to your screen. The sensor keeps an eye on all of your activities and rewards you with candy for sending a work email or finishing a long important paper. The more work tasks you perform, the more candy you get. A cyborg-like wrist pouch to carry pencils, phone, lip balm, and other little necessities on your wrist was patented in 2001. If you don't enjoy raking leaves in the fall, you'd probably love the unique solution described by its inventor as compatible with the natural body movement of a person. Leaf-gathering pants have zip-on flexible tubes attached to pant legs and a net fastened in between to gather leaves as you walk. You can easily remove the large piles you leave behind later. The greenhouse helmet was designed to bring nature to big city guys. You put on a self-enclosed anti-fog covered dome on your head with tiny plants on built-in shelves. When you exhale, the plants take care of all the bad elements and recharge you with the purest oxygen. The helmet would be equipped with an intercom system to let you communicate with people outside your dome. In case you have a pet, but don't have 24 hours in the day to give it all the non-stop physical attention it wants, the automatic pet petter is something you'd appreciate. It works for both cats and dogs with its mechanical hand and plays relaxing tunes to them. The gadget is activated when Spot or Jingles gets on a motion sensor platform. Pet ears can get in the wrong places, like a soup plate, and spread the food all over the place. Back in 1980, someone decided to take care of it and patented the lightweight, adjustable, and easy-to-use animal ear protectors. They were designed especially for pets, mostly dogs, with long ears to prevent any contact with food. They also suggested decorating the tubes on special occasions. An anti-eating face mask was invented around the same time for those who have to spend their days around food for professional reasons. Chefs, cooks, and other restaurant staff dealing with food can put it on and lock it with a little padlock. Breathing and talking are still possible, but it makes eating highly problematic. The most important thing is not to lose that key, or you'd have to go on an eternal diet. Sled pants were equipped with a seat to slide down hills, and leg and waist straps to keep them securely attached to the owner. They were configured to take the shape of the human body. To stop the sled once you reach your destination, you'd have to fold the lower part up and walk away, pretending you didn't just ride your own pants. The 1923 head exerciser was invented to give you better circulation. Two people would hold a metal plate between their teeth. The plates were held together by a spring. As the pair pulled each in their direction, they'd take part in a sort of tug-of-war for the head. Someone came up with a brilliant idea of a watch that would let you know how long you have left to live in years, months, and minutes. The life expectancy guess would be based on some statistical methods and personal health factors of the owner. The watch had a microprocessor for storing data and buttons and switches to reset that data. Pet display clothing would be the perfect choice for those who can't leave their master at home alone. It's a vest or a belt with many tubular passageways going all around the body of the owner. The whole construction is see-through. There are little chambers for feeding and to take the pet out. An automatic tip requester consisted of an artificial hand and a box for cash to wear on your wrist. When the money someone would drop down the connecting tube didn't seem enough, a no sale sign would pop up. Sea shoes invented in the 1960s made walking on water possible. They used duck-foot propellers and required some good sense of balance from the owner to stay afloat.
Hello, Brightsiders! I recently decided to propose to my girlfriend and I went to the jewelry shop. While choosing a ring, the seller told me stories about different stones, and one of them about why members of the royal family would never buy rubies was the most fascinating. Rumor has it that British monarchs see rubies as bad luck. But where would they get an idea like that, and why did the superstition start in the first place? Nobody knows, but many people put it down to Queen Victoria. The story goes that the 19th century monarch didn't like this gorgeous red gemstone. As you know, Victoria, the great-great-grandmother of Elizabeth II, was very influential, especially regarding fashion trends. And anything the Queen of Trendsetting did like almost instantly became mandatory. As proof, let's remember that white satin wedding dresses only became all the rage after Queen Victoria's marriage to Prince Albert in 1840. Before that, brides wore all sorts of colors. The only color considered bad luck was, get ready for this, white. Before Victoria changed the game, white was associated with misfortune. In some cultures, like in India, it still is. Since the Queen could so quickly turn what was once bad luck into a wedding custom that would live for ages, It's natural to think she did the same thing, only in reverse, with rubies. After all, Victoria didn't wear them at her wedding. She wore sapphires and diamonds. But where did her distaste for rubies come from? Just personal preference or fear of an ancient curse? Let's look at the facts. Victoria's mother celebrated her daughter's wedding by giving her what's known as ruby parure. A parure is a set of jewels the royals wear together, like earrings and a necklace. As its name implies, it was brimming with rubies. Before handing it down, Victoria wore the coronet that was part of the set on many occasions. There is also a theory that her husband was the one with the ruby phobia and forbade the gemstones on their wedding day. But it turns out to be a myth because Victoria's engagement ring, shaped like a serpent, was made of tiny rubies, diamonds, and an emerald. So while Queen Victoria started plenty of traditions, the idea that rubies are bad luck isn't one of them. And have all the British royals avoided rubies? Because there has definitely been some bad luck associated with the red gemstone. The marriages that come after a ruby engagement don't seem to stand the test of time. Look at Princess Margaret, sister of Elizabeth II, and Sarah, Duchess of York, who had been married to the Queen's son Andrew. Both had ruby engagement rings, and marriages didn't last. Maybe you've heard that as soon as Mary of Teck received a ruby engagement ring, the groom-to-be succumbed to influenza? Well, don't jump on the superstition train just yet. There's no evidence that Mary ever received a ring of any kind from the engagement. Her mother, Princess Mary Adelaide, Queen Victoria's cousin, didn't get a ruby ring. The marriage didn't end, but it was pretty much a case of Mary settling for a suitor because she had no other options. Not exactly an epic love story. Or do you think the gem was at fault? And what about all those other unhappy brides with rubies on their fingers? If we're looking for examples of unlucky marriages in the British monarchy, the first person that comes to mind is Henry VIII. Of Henry's 6 wives, 2 may have donned rubies. Anne of Cleves wore what looked like an emerald and a ruby ring in the portrait that convinced Henry to marry her. Unfortunately, the real Anne proved less appealing, so Henry ordered their marriage annulled the following year. On the bright side, if you know anything about what happened to Henry's other wives, then it seems like the ruby ring was a lucky one for Anne. Well, the second wife to wear the ring, Catherine of Howard, wasn't so lucky. I guess this disproves the theory altogether. But think about this. Many of the rocks on those engagement rings come from crowns. Unsurprisingly, the royal family has all sorts of bejeweled headpieces. Dainty coronets, small tiaras, and the one with the world's largest uncut ruby, the Black Princess ruby. You might not have heard the name, but I'm sure you've seen it. Picture the King or Queen of England and the big crown on their head, the one that looks like a puffy fur hat. It's known as the Imperial State Crown, and it's probably the reason why you drew crowns the way you did when you were a kid. You know, with the giant blob of red in the middle. Well, the blob is a ruby. Yeah, it's that big, about 2 inches long and weighing 170 carats. That's almost the weight of a golf ball, which wouldn't sound impressive if we weren't talking about the gemstone here. The famous and historic ruby isn't precisely a ruby, it's a spinel, but I won't get too technical here. It was named after Edward of Woodstock back in the 14th century, and he went by the nickname the Black Prince, because of the black armor and the shield he wore. Edward got the ruby from another king, Don Pedro the Cruel, in exchange for helping him to deal with some unrest in his territory. But before Edward got a hold of it, the giant gem had its own mysterious and troublesome past. Some people believe that the ruby was cursed by the Prince of Granada from who Don Pedro had taken it. There's no evidence that Don Pedro cursed the ruby again before giving it to Edward, but it's hard to imagine a guy nicknamed the Cruel parting very peacefully with a jewel that big. But did the Black Prince's ruby bring good luck or bad luck to the royals? I guess it depends on who you ask. Henry V wore a gem-encrusted helmet that included the Black Prince's ruby when fighting in France in 1415. One day, he got whacked in the head really hard. What's worse, he nearly lost his fancy helmet. Bad luck. Then again, he survived, and he kept the helmet and the ruby, so good luck. Richard III was supposedly wearing the Black Prince's ruby when he was in Bosworth Field fighting it out with Henry Tudor towards the end of the same century in 1485. All I'll say is, Richard wasn't so lucky. Yes, that points to the ruby being bad, but that's only a rumor. Maybe he wasn't wearing it at all. While you're thinking about that, consider this. That ruby now resides smack in the middle of one of history's most recognizable crowns. And as I said, a lot of royal engagement rings featured jewels that previously adorned crowns. Imagine what would happen if a would-be princess told her love-struck prince that she'd love to have, a big shiny ruby. I don't know, maybe the biggest one out there, the Black Prince's ruby. If you heard of Romeo and Juliet, you know it's not easy to dissuade young love. And when it comes to royal families who tend to marry royalty from other countries, such a denial could even start some major conflicts. Wouldn't it be better to avoid the whole thing by concocting a myth? Then the king could tell his love-struck son, I know she likes rubies and I'd love to give it to her, but did I tell you about the curse? Oh, it's terrible. If you love her and want her to be safe and happy, you must make sure she never wears this ruby. Or maybe the trends just changed over time. Rubies were out, diamonds were in, and that switch could have been done on purpose. We now see diamonds as the go-to engagement rock, but it wasn't always that way. Before 1940, only about 10% of brides-to-be received diamond engagement rings. What changed? Well, experts point to an ad campaign by a jeweler named De Beers Diamonds that linked these rocks with love. And it worked. But the more superstitious members of the royal family will swear by the evidence. If rubies mean short-lived marriage, then diamonds are forever. Like the 15-year marriage of Camilla and Charles, Sophie and Edward going strong for 20 years. Queen Elizabeth herself had a diamond engagement ring, and she and Prince Philip have been married for over 70 years. Maybe it's because of history or just trends. I'll let you decide why the British royal family has sworn off rubies.